Hello, I am Al Blue and I have been asked to be your guide on this first installment of Black History for Knuckleheads. I am here at the future home of the National Museum of African American History, located in the National Mall, here in Washington, D.C. It is scheduled to be completed by 2015. I figured this would be a good starting point, so with no further ado, let's start our trip back down history lane. Imagine, if you will, it is the year 1619, and we are no longer here at the future Museum of African American History and Culture, but we are instead here in the year 1619, when the first Africans, blacks or people of color, were forcibly used as involuntary laborers. A Dutch licensed slave ship would arrive at Jamestown, Virginia, and offload a cargo of 20 black slaves, thus starting the beginning of the slave trade in the future United States of America. The slave traders would later master the transportation and shipping of the precious human cargo. Here, take a look at some of the loading and shipping methods. This is a detailed drawing of the slave ship Brooks, showing how 484 slaves could be loaded and packed in the hull of the ship. The conditions were horrible, to say the least. Usually as many as one-half of the slaves would die before they would reach their final destination, and other slaves would starve themselves to death, or commit suicide, rather than find out what the future would bestow upon them. This rendering is from around 1789. This is another detailed drawing of a slave ship. The ships were packed in two ways. One was a loose pack, when the captain of the ship would not try to pack the hull to capacity, thus having to carry less food to feed the slaves, because the ship was carrying less slaves. The other way was cruel and brutal. It was called a tight pack, filling the hull of the ship with as many slaves as possible, not caring about the loss of life based on carrying more slaves. Usually in these type of packs, the captain did not care about the food for the slaves. He would simply throw slaves overboard if slave food was running low, thus remedying the problem. This next image is a recreation of what the pack conditions might have looked like during the slave trade period. Here, take a look. This is what a typical slave pack would look like. Just add another 400 to 500 more slaves. This practice would continue for several hundred years. Disease was common on slave ships. Most common was scurvy and smallpox. Millions of slaves would die on what is now known as the Middle Passage. These were some of the most brutal conditions of the time period. Our next stop on our journey will be here in Massachusetts, the first colony to legalize slavery, and that would be in 1641, thus the beginning of legal slavery in the newly formed colonies. Whites and Europeans were not the only merchants of slavery. In 1651, Anthony Johnson, a black man, brings 5 slaves to his farm in Virginia, thus becoming one of the first blacks to own slaves. His slave ownership also qualified Mr. Johnson to receive a land grant of some 200 acres. Other blacks would follow suit, and soon the area would become one of the largest amount of land owned by blacks, with black slaves. Our next stop on this historical journey will be Stono, South Carolina. I am here in Stono, South Carolina, in front of the home where one of the first slave revolts in American history took place. Cato, a slave, would lead an armed revolt, ending in the deaths of 30 whites and most of the slaves that took part in the revolt. I am here in Stono, South Carolina, in front of the historical marker for the Cato Uprising, or also called the Stono Rebellion. This would be one of many slave uprisings. Other revolts would come in a hard rebuttal of the slave laws and the unjust treatment of human beings. Our next stop on this journey will be Framingham, Massachusetts. I am here in Framingham, Massachusetts, the birth state of Crispus Attucks. In 1750, Crispus would run away from a slave owner. He would later be one of the first African Americans to die in the American Revolution. Behind me, that is an image of Mr. Attucks. Next up on our historical journey, Mount Vernon, New York. I am here in Mount Vernon, New York, at the estate of future President of the United States, Mr. George Washington. That is him behind me. In the Junius Brutus Stearns painting, also depicted are some of Washington's slaves. In 1752, George acquired the Mount Vernon estate. There were 18 slaves. By the end of his life, there were more than 200 slaves. At Mount Vernon, Washington would free all his slaves upon his death. Next we will head to Philadelphia. I am here in Philadelphia at a memorial plaque honoring John Woolman. Mr. Woolman is the Quaker writer who suggested that slavery is immoral and that no Quakers should participate in the practice. By 1757, it was accepted as an unwritten law by many in the Quaker community, but some Quakers still continued to deal in the slave trade. Next we head to Boston, Massachusetts. I am here in Boston, Massachusetts. The year is 1770. The date is March 5th, and on this day, 11 people would be shot, and 4 would die. Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick and Crispus Attucks would die. The incident would entail a British soldier firing into an unarmed crowd of civilians. The incident would later become known as the Boston Massacre. Abolitionists would look at Crispus Attucks as a martyr for his beliefs and conviction that all people should be free. Next stop on our historical journey through time, Bunker Hill. I am here in Boston, Massachusetts. The year 1775. There was a battle between the British and the Minutemen, as depicted in this rendering behind me, showing some of the, as they were called then, Negro soldiers. Salem Poor is also portrayed in the drawing. In this battle, there are more than a dozen African Americans fighting with the Minutemen, both freedmen and slaves. However, one stands out above all others. Salem Poor, a New England slave who had purchased his freedom for the sum of 27 pounds. Salem is credited with shooting and killing famed British Lieutenant Colonel Abercrombie, and in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress bars Negroes from the Revolutionary War, and in Virginia, Lord Dunmore, a British governor, offers freedom to any slaves that would fight on the side of the British. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, at General Washington's location. I am here in Philadelphia, the year 1775, where upon hearing that the British were accepting all black slaves and promising them their freedom if they fought with the British, General Washington has no choice but to tell his officers to allow the blacks to serve in the Continental Army with the same provisions, their freedom in exchange for their service in the Army. Washington, who at first opposed Negroes serving in the Army, had no choice if he wanted to win the war. The picture behind me shows Washington leading a charge with several black soldiers in his ranks. The Continental Congress would later approve Washington's proposal to allow Negroes to serve in the military. Our next stop, the Delaware River. I am here at the Delaware River. The year is 1776. General George Washington is crossing the Delaware. On board the small boat are 2 Negro soldiers, Oliver Cromwell, and at the helm of the boat was Prince Whipple, as portrayed in this famous painting by artist Emmanuel Lutz, titled Washington Crossing the Delaware. During the same period, Thomas Jefferson's proposal denouncing slavery are stricken and eliminated from the Declaration of Independence. A redrafted and watered-down version would later be signed. Our next stop on this historical journey, Vermont. I am here, Vermont, the first state to abolish slavery. The year is 1777, the date July 2nd. The document behind me is a part of Vermont's historical record, which for one thing, states any child born in the state of Vermont was born free, regardless of skin color of the parents. Next, we are going to head to Rhode Island. Rhode Island, the year is 1778. The formation of the 1st Black Regiment takes place, with more than 300 former slaves, and some free men as well. Although the unit was not all black, whites and Europeans were also in the battalion, the name would stick, and the unit would be forever known as the Black Regiment. Later in the same year, the unit would see battle against the Hessians. The unit would kill more than 1,000 enemy soldiers. There would be more battles to come, including Point's Bridge in New York. Our next stop on our trip will be Ohio. Ohio. The year is 1787, the date July 13th. The Continental Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance, which forbids slavery past the Ohio River. I am standing in front of a marker that marks the historical date, and this behind me is a replica of the famous ordinance, explaining what it entails and the boundaries. Next, we head to Philadelphia. Philadelphia. The year is 1787. Prince Hall starts the first African-American Masonic Lodge, bearing the lodge number 459. Meanwhile in New York City, the first school to educate blacks was opened. That is a rendering of the school behind me. Once again, the year is 1787. It would be known as the African Free School. Most of the first students were the offspring of slaves. However, there were freeborn blacks also. 6 more schools for blacks would later open. Let's head back to Philadelphia. Philadelphia. The year is 1793. Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act. The law makes it illegal to harbor a slave or hinder in his or her arrest. The poster behind me is one of the many that circulated in some of the states that did not accept the law. This poster warns free blacks and runaway slaves not to trust police officers and watchmen, because these same persons would turn blacks in for the reward money, be they free or not. It was common practice for kidnappers to steal free blacks and then transport them down south to be sold off as slaves. The year is 1795, and one of George Washington's slaves has run away. George would advertise looking for his runaway slave with an ad similar to the one shown behind me. The following year, 1796, Tennessee would be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, totally destroying any rights that free blacks already living there had. The year is 1800, and Nat Turner is born as a slave here in Southampton, Virginia. He would later lead one of the bloodiest slave uprisings in American history. I am here at the historical marker where the incident would begin some 30 years later. In 1831, Nat Turner and his comrades would kill more than 50 white people in their revolt. Nat Turner, as well as all of his men, would later be caught, as depicted in the painting behind me. They would be tried and executed. This is one of many slave revolts that would occur during the period, but Nat's would be remembered as one of the bloodiest. Next we head to the year 1808. It is the year 1808, and Congress has just outlawed the importation of African slaves. The law, however, is mostly ignored by the slave traders of the South, who greatly need the slave labor for the production of their cotton crops. At that very same time, and year 1808, there are over 1 million African slaves in the newly formed United States. Cotton was a cash crop, and really lots of money for the plantation owners. The year is 1810, and President Madison begs Congress to punish those that will not follow the law as pertaining to slavery. Cotton is still king of the South. President Madison stated the following: I advise Congress to devise further means of suppressing the evil practice. The year is 1811, and the state of Delaware has proclaimed free blacks can no longer migrate to the state, and furthermore, any free black that is born in the state of Delaware and leaves the state for more than 6 months will be considered a non-resident of the state. Next we head to Louisiana. Louisiana. The year is 1811. Charles Deslandes, the image behind me, and about 500 men, both free and slaves, head for New Orleans. The slave army was armed with hoes, rakes, knives, and some guns, leaving a path of destruction along the way, killing plantation owners, but sparing the lives of women and children. The revolt would come to a halt at Jacques Fortier's plantation. A group of well-armed soldiers would force Charles and his men to turn back, putting them in the crossfire. Surviving plantation owners had attacked their rear. Very few of Charles' make shift army escaped, but Charles Deslandes was tried and found guilty. He was shot by firing squad and then beheaded. His head would be stuck on a pole and displayed on a New Orleans river levee to scare other slaves thinking of revolting. In 1812, Louisiana was admitted to the Union as a slave state. The year is 1827, and New York City abolishes slavery. Jump to the year 1839. A group of slaves take control of the Spanish slave ship, the Amistad, killing the ship's captain, Ferrer, as depicted in the rendering behind me, by artist John W. Barber. The slaves manage to sail the ship to Montauk, Long Island. They would take their case to the Supreme Court. Eventually, the Supreme Court would rule in the slaves' favor, and the Africans were allowed to return to their homeland. The year is 1827, and Harriet Tubman escapes from slavery. Harriet, at far left in the photo, behind me. In theory, in this image, Harriet is supposed to be the train's conductor, and the slaves are the passengers of this invisible underground railroad. Harriet would lead more than 300 slaves to their freedom. Harriet was of direct African descent. Both her parents were Africans. Her birth name was Araminta Ross, the name of both her parents. Harriet would also serve as a spy for the U.S. Army during the war. Upon her death, she was buried with full military honors. The year is 1857. Dred Scott, shown in the painting behind me, takes his case to the Supreme Court. Scott, who claims that his master took him and his wife into free states and lived in these free states as well, and based on this, he should be granted his and his wife's freedom. The Dred Scott decision is decided by the Supreme Court. The decision states that blacks are not and will not be considered United States citizens. Therefore, Mr. Scott has no right to bring suit against his owner. The court also stated that Congress does not have the authority to restrict slavery in any federal territory. Many in the public were outraged by this decision, especially Dred Scott and his wife. Eventually the Scotts would gain their freedom. The year is 1862. The date, July 17th. Congress allows black soldiers to enlist in the Union Army. More than 100,000 will enlist. Some 40,000 will pay with their life. Here are some images of some of the black units that served during the Civil War. The 1st Louisiana Native Guard. Black soldier, William H. Carney, shown in the picture behind me, the first black soldier to receive the Medal of Honor. Let's move forward to the year 1860. Abraham Lincoln is elected as the 16th president. Fast forward to 1863, the date January 1st. The Emancipation Proclamation is ratified. It frees all slaves in states rebelling against the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation might have freed the slaves. Many felt that slaves were not truly freed until the 13th Amendment was in place, which took place December 18, 1865. This document totally outlaws slavery, even though in some states, slavery would still exist, like in Kentucky and Delaware, which would continue to have slavery until the turn of the century. In the year 1868, the South Carolina House is controlled by 87 black legislators and 40 white legislators. The only legislature to have a black majority. The blacks would control the South Carolina House until 1874. Let's move forward to the year is 1868, and on July 28th, the 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship rights to all that are born in the United States or naturalized in the U.S. In 1870, the 15th Amendment guarantees voting rights to all male U.S. citizens. 1865, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Later the same year, Jefferson Davis allows slaves to fight in the Confederate Army. This, however, would have no impact on the outcome of the war. The year 1866, Fisk University, a college for Negroes, is opened in Nashville. In 1867, in Atlanta, Morehouse, a college for Negroes, is also opened. The year is 1875, and the date is March 1st. Congress passes a civil rights bill. that bans discrimination in public places. The bill would be later overturned in 1883. Next, the year is 1896, and the date is May 18th. The Supreme Court's decision on the Plessy v. Ferguson case affirms separate but equal facilities in all public places. The year 1905, the date July 12th, the Niagara Movement is formed. The movement would later morph into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. W.E. Du Bois is one of the members. The year is 1889. Ex-slave and author Frederick Douglass, as depicted in the painting behind me, is appointed United States Minister to Haiti. The year is 1908, and the first black sorority is formed at Howard University. It would be known as Alpha Kappa Alpha. The year is 1909, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is founded in New York City. In that same year, explorer Matthew Henson, a black member of Admiral Perry's Arctic expedition, places the United States flag at the North Pole. This brings us to the end of Part 1 of Black History for Knuckleheads. We will continue the historical journey in Part 2 of Black History for Knuckleheads.